read you a story that Pastor Carter gave to me on Wednesday night to read, and it's very, very touching. I saw a strange sight and experienced something amazing. It was hard for me to explain. If you give me a few minutes, I'll do my best to describe it. Before dawn one Friday morning, I noticed a young man, handsome and strong, walking through the back alleys of the city. He was pulling an old cart filled with clothes, both bright and new. And as he pulled the cart, he was calling out in a clear voice, a powerful voice, "Rags, rags, new rags for old. I'll take the tired rags." The air was foul in the dark side streets and tainted by the filth and trash that living unleashed on the world. And yet, as the man called out, the air began to get a tinge of a faint scent of cleanliness. And as though the breeze that carried the sweet music of his voice also carried the hope and promise of a cleansing rain and purifying wind. Rags, new rags for old. I take your tired rags. The man continued to move through the dim lit of the early morning, his strong voice echoing from building to building and street to street. Now it made me curious, and I thought to myself, for this man stood 6'4", and his arms were like tree limbs, hard and muscular. His eyes flashed with intelligence. What was he doing here in a city that had no need for someone giving out and selling used old rags? Could he find no better job than this? To be a ragman in this city? Driven by my curiosity, I followed him, and I wasn't disappointed. Soon the ragman saw a woman sitting on a porch. It was a small house, and she was crying, and she held this rag up to her face, and she sobbed, sobs of thousands of tears. Her body language said it all. She seemed to fold into herself. Her shoulders were down, back slumped forward, knees and elbows into an X. She had no hope. Her heart was breaking. Her body may have been alive, but her soul had died. The ragman stopped his cart, and quietly he walked over to the woman, and stepping around empty beer cans, old newspapers, dead toys, and broken furniture, "Give me your rag," he said gently as he knelt beside her, "and I'll give you another." The woman looked into his powerful, compassionate eyes and saw something there that paused her tears. The ragman slipped the rag from her hand and used it one last time to dry the tears from her eyes. Never taking his eyes off of hers, he laid across her lap a linen cloth, so clean and new that it shined. She looked down at the new cloth and then back again to the eyes of the man who had given it to her. The ragman slowly leaned forward and kissed the woman's forehead, and then turned and walked back to his cart. As he began to pull his cart again, the ragman did a strange thing. He put the old, used, stained rag to his face, and he began to weep. He sobbed, and he sobbed. Grievously he sobbed, as she had done. His shoulders were shaking as the tears flowed down his face. Oh, it was such sad grief. He looked back to the woman on the porch, and I could see that she was left without a tear. She sat with her shoulders high and looked a wonder in her face. This was amazing, I thought, and I followed the sobbing ragman. Like a curious child, I could not turn away. This was a mystery, and I watched the ragman from a distance. Rags, rags, new rags for old, rang the voice forth. It was strong, and it shook with emotion as he wept. Rags, rags for your old rags, new ones for your old. In a while, the sky showed a light gray behind the rooftops, and it was light enough to make out shredded curtains and damaged blinds that hung in a dark window. The ragman came upon a girl sitting curbside, whose head was wrapped in a bandage. Her eyes were vacant as the windows around her, and blood soaked that bandage on her head, and a single line of blood ran down her cheek. The ragman paused. He turned his weeping eyes upon this empty image of child, and reaching into his cart, he withdrew from it a beautiful yellow hat and walked towards the girl. "Give me your rag," he said softly, "and I'll give you mine." The child did not move and could only gaze at him vacantly while he loosened the bandage on her head, and he removed it and tied it to his own instead. I gasped at what I saw. With the bandage went the wound, and the girl's head was left unblemished, while the ragman's head began to bleed. He set the hat on the little girl's head, and suddenly her eyes took on an understanding and intelligence that had been missing before. She placed her hand to the side of her head, where the bandage had covered the wound. It was no longer there. Smiling in wonder, she watched as the ragman rose unsteady to his feet and moved back to his cart. "Rags, rags, I'll take the old rags," cried out the sobbing, bleeding ragman. "New rags for old rags." With his powerful arms pulling the cart, he continued on his way. He seemed to be moving faster, and there was an urgency that I hadn't noticed before. He stopped again in front of a man that was leaning against a telephone pole. "Are you going to work?" he asked. And the man shook his head. "Do you have a job?" The man looked up at him. He looked down, and making note of the ragman's weeping eyes and his bleeding head, he began to reply, "Are you crazy?" He looked at him as he leaned against the pole, revealing that the right sleeve of the man's jacket was flat and the cuff stuffed in his pocket. He had no arm. "Give me your jacket," said the ragman firmly, "and I'll give you mine." Such quiet authority in his voice. The one-armed man looked into the other's eyes and then slowly took off his jacket, and so did the ragman. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief as I trembled at what I saw. Ragman's arm stayed in its sleeve, and when the other man put it on. He had 2 good arms, strong as tree limbs. The ragman was left with 1. He said as he moved back to his cart, struggling to make do with the 1 arm, the ragman began to pull the cart. Much faster this time and with a greater urgency. He came upon an unconscious old drunk lying beneath an army blanket. Oh, he was wheezing and he was hunched and he was sick. He took the blanket and wrapped it around himself. But for the drunk, he left him new clothes. And now I had to run to keep up with Ragman. He was weeping uncontrollably and freely bleeding from his forehead. He struggled to pull the cart, and with 1 arm, while stumbling from drunkenness, falling again and again, exhausted, old, and sick. Yet he moved with a terrible speed, nearly splinting through the alleys of the city, covering block after block and mile after mile. I wept to see the change in this man. I hurt to see his sorrow, and I ached each time he fell and stumbled. And when he began to move through the industrial area of the city, away from the houses and apartments, I wanted to stop following him. I wanted to turn away from my grief, to leave it behind and go back to my life. But I could not. I needed to see this sad, amazing story to an end. Who was this ragman? Why had he done what he had done for nobody? Nobody else would have done it for these unknown people. Where was he going? And why was he in such a hurry? How would it end? The once strong ragman was now old and frail, weeping and bleeding, staggering and falling, his body wrecked with pain, sorrow, and disease. I watched as he came to an old abandoned lot that was filled with trash, old furniture, and rusted out shells of cars and construction equipment. He moved among the garbage pits and piles of human refuse and finally climbed to the top of a small hill made from trash and 1,000 lives. He struggled to pull his cart, and it was sad. It was pathetic. It was his burden. With tormented labor, he cleaned a little spot on the top of the hill. With a deep sigh, he slowly made bed with the contents of his cart, and he lay on it. He pillowed his head on a rag that the woman had and a jacket. He covered his old aching bones with an army blanket. His body shook under the load of its injuries and pain and disease. His eyes wept, and the wound under his bandage continued to bleed. With one last deep sigh, he closed his eyes and he died. Oh, how I cried to witness that death. I sat down in an old abandoned car. I wailed and I moaned as one who has no hope. I wept because I had come to love the ragman. As I had followed him, I had watched him work wonders and change lives so profoundly that it didn't seem fair that he was gone. He had taken those things that were solid and damaged beyond repair and had replaced them with new and with the whole. He had offered hope to the damaged and lost in the city. But if the ragman was gone, then there was no hope. There was none for me as well. I felt such an overwhelming sense of grief and loss that I remained in the private seclusion of the rusted out old car, and I sobbed myself to sleep. I did not know how I could know that I had slept Friday night and Saturday and through Saturday night as well. And then on Sunday morning, I was awakened by a violence that shook me to the core of my being. Light, pure and hard, shone in and slammed against my tear-stained face and demanded that I wake. And when I was finally able to open my eyes, I blinked against the light and squinted in the direction of the pile of trash where the ragman's body had been. And as I looked, I saw the last and the first wonder of all. The ragman was there, yes, but he was no longer dead. He was alive. There he stood, folding the old army blanket carefully and laying it atop the neatly arranged old rag and jacket. Beside the scar on his head, there was no other evidence of what he had previously taken upon himself. There was no sign of sorrow or age, no evidence of illness or deformity. His body was whole and strong, and all the rags that he had gathered shined with a brightness I cannot describe. I wept to see him again, and when I thought that hope had died along with Ragman, I abandoned any hope for my own life. And yet there he stood, healthy and whole. Climbing from my shelter, I moved toward the ragman, trembling from what I had seen and because of what I knew I needed to do. Walking to him with my head lowered, I spoke my name to him with shame, and looking up into his clear, loving, compassionate eyes, I spoke with yearning in my voice. Rags, rags, please take my tired rags and replace them with new ones. And he did just that, taking the old tired rags of my existence and covered the griefs and the wounds of my life, my sadly lived life. He replaced them with new clothes and a life spent following him. He put new rags on me, and I am now a reflection of the hope he offers to us all. The ragman, he is our Christ.
Amen.
And I hope that you all follow him.
Praise the Lord.